I'm David Stewart, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about storycrafting. That is the art of creating a good story, the art of story writing. Whether you're a screenwriter or a novelist, or you are a graphic novelist, or you're a playwright, or you're just trying to create a story through some media, I think it's a good idea to know all the elements that go into creating a good, effective, meaningful, memorable story for your audience. So this will be the first video in a series, and later videos I'm going to go into a little more depth for all of these elements. And in this one I'm going to talk about the definition of a story and the three big elements that go into contributing to your story, the three basic elements that end up making up a story. So let's start with the definition. This is a working definition, so I'm happy to distill it a little bit with your feedback. So if you have some ideas to make it more accurate, make it more precise, make it broader perhaps to include more things, please let me know, because I would love to be able to create a more functional and meaningful definition of what a story is. This is one that I just kind of came up with, and I'm not going to say it's the most accurate thing possible, but I am happy to revise it. So here's what it is. A story is an artistic representation of characters acting to resolve a conflict. So it's artistic, meaning it's transmitted through art of some kind. And it's a representation of characters, meaning those characters are not doing this in real life. Like if you have somebody killing someone, they're not actually killing someone. So it's a representation. You have characters. Characters have their own thoughts, ideas, motivations, and they're trying to pursue those. They're acting. That means they're not just kind of rolling through random chance. They're acting, and they're trying to resolve a conflict. They're trying to achieve some goal. So that's what it is. It's a representation of characters acting to resolve a conflict. And I'm happy to work on that definition. With that definition in mind, there are actually three different big elements that go into creating a story. Setting, characters, and finally plot. And plot is the one that we really tend to focus on a lot. And certainly I make objections to lots of different plot moves, but all three have to be present. And really you have to have setting before you have characters. You have to have characters before you have plot. And all three of them have to agree with each other for that story to be immersive and to be coherent. So the first thing I'll talk about is setting. Setting is the most important decision that you can make with your story, because setting is going to determine all the possibilities and all the limitations for what the characters can and can't do when they're acting out the plot. So it's more than just like your scenery and your clothing. So if you set something in 17th century Scotland, it's more than just dudes wearing kilts standing around near, wooden buildings and castles, right? It's going to be all the cultural attitudes that create those characters, the culture of it, the religion. The weather is part of the setting, and the weather determines the clothes, right? And the culture determines the attitude towards clothes, towards marriage, towards relationships, towards sex, everything that goes into culture. All of those attitudes are then going to be impressed upon your characters. Your characters come from their setting. They're not independent of their setting. So in 17th century Scotland, you're probably not going to have too many people who are Taoist. You're not going to have someone just conjure up a Taoist philosophy in 17th century Scotland. Nor if you set something in ancient China are you going to have too many libertarians, right? You're not going to have somebody who is a libertarian in ancient China because there's no philosophy surrounding them that would bring forth that sort of individual set of ideas and those individual moral ethics. And even if they conjured them up, there's so many other cultural pressures that would really repress that you're not going to see libertarians. So the setting is going to really, really confine your story possibilities and your characters' possibilities. Your characters have to agree with their setting. And so the attitudes, the attributes of the characters, those come from the setting just as much as the buildings, the clothes, whatever else you're doing. The setting also determines what dangers are going to be present for your characters, what conflicts are going to be possible with your characters. The setting is really the playing field of the game. So before you play the game, you have to decide what field you're going to play on. And it's a very important decision because depending on the story that you want to tell, it may not be possible to tell it in ancient China or in 1920s New York or in some sort of futuristic fantasy setting. So it just really depends on the story you want to tell, what setting that you want to put it in. The second one is the characters. Like I said, characters are derived from the setting. But characters are individuals with their own desires and aims. You have to decide when you're creating characters what their aims are going to be, what their attitudes are going to be towards their setting, towards their culture, towards other people, what their flaws are, what their strengths are. All those things are going to determine how they're going to think about what actions they're going to perform when they're acting out the plot. A character who's very weak and timid will not suddenly become very, very brave and attack somebody with a sword unless they've had a long time in the story to build up to that point where they are gaining enough courage or they finally snap and are able to attack someone. So the plot can help characters change, but the attributes that characters start with are important for creating that plot journey. So you have to think about the attributes of your characters within their setting before you even really begin to design the plot, because the plot can only be acted out by the characters, and it can only be acted out according to those characters, not only their capabilities, but what desires they would reasonably have and what things they would reasonably think about. If you're setting your story in ancient China, they're probably not going to conjure up some sort of scientific invention to solve a plot problem. Okay, so you have to think about what your characters can reasonably think up within their setting as well. Now, the other important thing about characters that generates the plot, this is really what generates the plot, are the conflict between characters, because characters have their own goals. Those goals are going to conflict with other characters' goals, and that's where you really get the tension in a story. Is one character's trying to achieve his aims, another character has different aims that conflict with those, or they're trying to prevent the protagonist from achieving their aims, and that's where you get all the conflict and all the different points that are going to create a plot. So characters have to have conflict with other forces opposing them, or they have to have different goals than those forces or the other characters that are opposing them. Those forces can be internal, so you can have like characters that have an internal struggle, like the story of an addict trying to overcome an addiction. That's actually can be a very, very good story and have a big and meaningful impact on whatever you're doing. But it's not going to be one that is necessarily external, but it's still a conflict. Okay. The third thing is plot. Plot is the series of actions, the series of events that bring about the story. It's the quote, the story itself. So it tends to be what people really, really focus on, are sort of the actions of the plot. But a plot can be totally and completely sabotaged by having characters and settings that don't agree with what the plot is doing. So everything that happens in the plot is derived from what the characters are capable of and what limitations the setting has imposed upon those characters. That being said, plot tends to have some sort of structure. It tends to have a structure as a series of events as the characters act out the plot. And those events are usually based around the idea of tension and release, or conflict and resolution. I like to think of tension and release because if you're reading like a horror book or you're watching a horror movie, there's a tension in the anticipation of something bad happening that we really want to be either resolved by something bad actually happening or from like the light being shined into the darkness to show that that wasn't actually a threat. Okay, so with that in mind, a lot of people tend to focus on structure, I think, a little too much. I'm going to show you one thing that I think is quite a common scene in education. Certainly I remember this from growing up. It's like, this is a story structure. You have an exposition. This tells you all about your characters. You have a rising action, whatever that is. There's a climax, and then a falling action, and a denouement. Denouement just means resolution, like the revelation of all the things that really mattered in the story. I don't necessarily think this is a very good way to view a story, and as we dig into plot structure, that'll become more apparent, because it's just a pyramid. Like, this pyramid doesn't... I remember this from when I was in school, but imagine you have a really big, thick book like Words of Radiance, right? This book's like 1,100 pages, which would mean that the climax is like here. Boy, that is quite a lot of book left for falling action and denouement. In reality, this book, the climax is like this. That's the entire climax in this book. And the resolution is like, you know, this much. It's like 20 pages. So the resolution is actually very, very small. So other people have like revised this this sort of old-fashioned way of looking at a plot. And of course, the rising action, this is like a whole book. Like, what do you do in the rising action? Like, well, I'll tell you. Well, when we dig into it, we'll dig into it a little bit deeper. Here's a little bit more revised version of like a plot diagram where you have an inciting incident that creates the conflict. So the conflict is really, character has a goal. They're trying to achieve that goal. And the rising action is them struggling to achieve that goal. The climax is am I going to achieve it or not? And the falling action, I don't know what that is, but basically then you have a resolution. You either achieve the action or you fail to achieve the action, and that's the resolution. So this is a little more accurate, but it's still very nebulous. We don't really know what rising action means. Even more nebulous, or I should say, this is really what closer to what it'll look like. You have a bunch of tension and release points, a bunch of obstacles that leads to a climax, and then you finally have a resolution. But if you just Google 3-act structure, you're going to see this same little arc over and over again, right? You have an introduction, rising action, a crisis, and a falling action. The 3-act structure is what a lot of people think movies are written in. And when I talk about movie and screenwriting structure, I'll dispel that myth a little bit. I don't think the 3-act structure exists quite in the way people think it does. I think the 3-act structure is something that is a theory imposed upon art and not art that's derived from theory. That's an important thing to talk about. It's a theory that's imposed upon art, not a theory that's derived from watching art. What that means is that, some things may be 3 acts, and then you're always trying to figure out how that movie fits into a 3-act structure. But in reality, when you're trying to create plot points, you're probably not going to be thinking about 3 acts quite like this. And it's very uncertain just how those 3 acts work. When we get into a little bit deeper into just structure in general, we'll talk about what acts really mean. An act is one way of breaking down the story into sort of sub-conflicts and subsections of action. And that's it. So that's the third thing that you have to think about with plot is structure. But it's certainly not the only thing. Plot is really just characters acting out their goals. So I'll reemphasize, here's those 3 things. Setting, characters, plot. Setting is the world. If you do a fantasy setting, it's the world that you create. Characters are the people that are in that world, and they have to be logically derived from that setting. And the plot is the characters acting out their goals and desires, which are in conflict with other goals and desires. That's really what the plot is. And if any of those things don't agree, then you're going to eliminate immersion from the viewer or from the reader, and that's going to pull them out of the story, make the story seem unbelievable or incoherent, or all sorts of other things that will make them say, this is not a good story, or make them do the worst thing imaginable, which is you're reading a book, and you take it, and you put it down. That's probably one of the worst things that can happen if you're a writer, is that you just lose the audience. Because it's a lot easier. You're going to see a lot more people pick up a book and not finish it than you're going to see people walk into a movie and walk out halfway through. That's just the way it is. 2 hours is not that big a commitment, but this book, that's a big commitment. You don't want to lose your reader. So this is the first part in the series. I'll continue with setting and characters and plot. Setting will be first, and we'll talk about all the different ways that you can set a particular piece and what that will sort of produce and how to pick a good setting that's going to tell the story that you want to tell. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You can read some of my books at dvspress.com. You can see more organization of my music stuff on the channel at davidvstewart.com. You can also find me on Twitter as @davidvstewart. You can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/davidvandykestewart. And I am pretty good about responding to messages both in the comments and on the channel and elsewhere. So if you have any feedback, please give it to me. Please let me know what you want to see and what you want to hear. I'm always happy to deliver if I reasonably can. And hopefully we'll have lots of other stuff on the way with this series. I have a nasty habit of beginning series and then taking a long time to finish them because I have so much going on and I have so many other things that I want to accomplish, especially when I'm doing a series about how to play particular things in music. Sometimes it takes me a long time to get back around to looking at that next piece and actually videoing it. That's a weird verb. But I usually will eventually get to it. So thanks so much again for watching, and I hope you have a great evening.